Type Moon houses some truly great and memorable characters of a wide variety. They can range from being incredibly dark and profoundly disturbed to really goofy, fun, and just plain over the top. In this analysis, we're going to be focusing on a character that most assuredly falls in the dark and disturbed variety by the name of Kotomine Kirei. He is easily one of my absolute most favorite characters in the Type Moon universe, and quite possibly one of my most favorite characters of all time. I'm going to be perfectly frank with you guys and say that I didn't always feel so strongly about this character. That's not to say I ever disliked Kotomine. I always thought that he was good, but the more I reflected on him, particularly during the process of this analysis to be even more honest, the more I realized just how great he truly is. Hopefully by the end of this analysis, you will come to understand my point of view and firmly grasp why I hold him in such high regard. To start things off, Kotomine is one of the main antagonists of the Fate franchise. Cause who doesn't love a good villain, am I right? His role is most prominent in Fate Zero, which is a prequel that takes place 10 years prior to Fate Stay Night. His role was equally relevant in the Heaven's Feel route of the Fate Stay Night visual novel. Technically speaking, he was the main villain in the Fate route, but his character wasn't fully explored until said Heaven's Feel route. To give some context, the Fate route is the first route, while Heaven's Feel is the third and final route. Since most people haven't read the visual novel, and as of this recording there is no anime or manga adaptation of the Heaven's Feel route yet, I'm mostly going to be focusing on his role in Fate Zero, since otherwise most viewers would more likely than not feel alienated. That being said, I will use my knowledge of the visual novel when necessary to fill in some gaps that were not already filled in by Fate Zero itself. So if you've only seen Fate Zero and I start talking about things that make you go, hey, wait a minute, I never heard anything like this before, it's pretty safe to assume where I got my information from. Now hold it right fucking there, okay? Didn't you read the warning I posted at the start of the video? If you're feeling anxious of any spoilers after hearing what I just said, keep in mind that these details are very minor at best, and nothing plot significant from the visual novel is going to be revealed in this video. I assure you that the only prerequisite needed to enjoy this analysis is having seen Fate Zero. If you ever intend to read the visual novel, which I do definitely recommend, this most assuredly will not take anything away from your enjoyment of it. On that note, I do have to apologize to those that wanted the analysis to extend into the visual novel as well, as there is absolutely some very interesting things to discuss concerning his character within the visual novel itself. But with that in mind, I hope you understand and respect my decision, and enjoy the analysis regardless. Plus, in case you haven't noticed the absurd length of this video and the fact that I'm cutting it up into parts, if I actually went as far as to include content from the visual novel as well, it probably would have to be its own part. And truth be told, I may do that sometime down the line, but I have no plans of doing that in the foreseeable future just yet. Alright, enough fucking around. Let's get to the nitty gritty and jump headfirst into this. I present to you my analysis of Kotomine Kirei. Kotomine Kirei is the son of Kotomine Rize, who is a priest for a church simply known as the Holy Church. As such, Kotomine, like his father, is also a priest for that same church, and was brought up with the same values taught by said church. Aside from the church teachings, Rize raised his son to be an individual with good sense and morals, much like one would imagine a priest would do when raising his own child. Now, while Rize did think that his son was growing up in a way that he thought was, morally speaking, on the right path, there was a key issue he was mostly unaware of. This issue being that Rize did not fully understand his own son, and a pivotal reason for that is because not even Kotomine understood himself. Now that may not sound like much at first, because I'm sure all of us at some point or another can relate with others not understanding us, and sometimes not even understanding ourselves properly. Believe it or not, it's actually quite normal, especially at a young age, because this is when we're still figuring ourselves out. But, and a big but, to truly get across that this is not the same thing as what a normal person might experience, it would actually be more fitting to say that Kotomine was, on a fundamental level, puzzled by his own nature, rather than just doing, saying, or feeling something that might be considered somewhat questionable, Kotomine's inner turmoil is within the realm of the existential. The saddest thing about Kotomine's situation is that despite his father Rize's honest-to-goodness intentions, the methods of which he used to raise his son are in direct correlation with the problem at hand, thus influencing how he turned out in the end. Yeah, you wouldn't think a priest raising his own kid would end up breeding a fucking psychopath, but to be fair, it's not entirely his fault, but he definitely played his part unbeknownst to him. Kotomine, quite early on in his life, became aware of the discord between himself and everyone around him. It was actually described as him just waking up one morning and realizing this, and then thinking to himself, how could it be that he didn't realize it sooner? It's kind of funny in its own way. Now, what is this discord he's feeling? Is specifically the notion of beauty and purity that his father, and by extension everyone else around him, in other words a bunch of religious nuts, believed in and received happiness from through their religion. So while others would preach about love, kindness, and other fluffy positive stuff, he felt nothing in relation to them and instead noticed that he gravitated more towards negative emotions. He thought of this as a mistake, and that the happiness he felt from what people around him condemned was inherently wrong because it was not in accordance with the order of all things and what he was taught. Wanting to feel a normal sense of happiness like everyone else around him, and to bring a sense of spiritual balance between himself and the world, he concluded that this mistake required his full attention and had to be corrected, something he would dedicate a large portion of his life to. Kotomine is not your ordinary, everyday sort of priest, and neither was his father. While we aren't given too much information about him, we do learn that he was the judge of the Third Holy Grail War, as well as returning judge to the fourth one during the events of Fate Zero. Being given the task of overseeing this important event implies his high standing in the church. Going back to Kotomine though, he didn't simply preach or give speeches, he was actually trained. What the training itself entails, I'm not entirely sure. As far as I know, this information has not been divulged in detail. You may be thinking to yourself, so what if he was trained? That doesn't sound like much. Well, there's more to it than that. I may not know the particulars of the training itself, but the training that I'm talking about, which Kotomine started at age 10, was to be an Executor. The title alone should tell you a lot. Before going on, I must explain that the Holy Church in the Fate universe should not be seen in the same light as an orthodox religion one would normally be familiar with in the real world. Okay, at the risk of pointing something out that might make you go, yeah, no shit, Sherlock, it's imperative to realize that the Holy Church is steeped in mystery, and pulling back the veil even somewhat will help in understanding how they affected Kotomine's character and growth from childhood right up to adulthood. As for how the church compares to any real-world religions, as far as I know, the church is aesthetically similar to the Roman Catholic Church, and that's pretty much it. There really isn't anything else of note. Now, if you're even a little bit familiar with the Type Moon universe, you should know that magic exists, and also that it's generally kept a secret, and the church has a particularly influential hand in keeping it all under wraps. If you ever wondered how the mess servants make during their battles were cleaned up and covered up after the fact, while sometimes the masters take their own precautions, it's typically the church that takes care of it. The best evidence of the church going out of their way to cover up these sorts of incidents is actually during Kiritsugu's flashback episode, where not long after his village was taken over by dead apostles, the church sent their very own executors to take care of it. And by take care of it, I of course mean they fucking kill everyone and burn the village down to the ground. Such a lovely church, the kind of place you want to take grandma on Sundays. Jokes aside, the flashback also reveals yet another dubious element of the church, which is that they actually take it upon themselves to destroy creatures and heretics they deem to be unholy abominations by their standards. Another clear example that exposes the bloodstained church for what they really are is something that happened to a character from Tsukihime, which is another visual novel that takes place in the very same universe. I won't reveal who this character is, however, because it is an enormous spoiler, and to make it clear, I do strongly recommend you read it as well because it is very good. Just don't watch the anime. Oh god, it's a terrible show and an even worse adaptation. Luckily the manga's actually pretty good, so I'd say to check that out if you want. Getting back on track, the character in question was viewed upon by the church as an abomination that shouldn't exist. This unfortunately prompted them to torture the character for an entire month in an attempt to analyze said character's immortality. This was, as you might have guessed, a rather thinly veiled attempt to dispose of this character permanently if they could. I want to make this clear that while this character was being tortured, just because the character is immortal, that doesn't mean they're invulnerable. This character endured that month of torture, feeling all of that pain, and the church simply did not give a fuck about what kind of suffering they were inflicting. With this information in mind, I hope this paints a very clear picture as to what the Holy Church is like in the Fate universe. Not only to distinguish the differences between reality and fiction, but more importantly to get across the sort of people Kotomine surrounded himself with and how they would have a rather questionable effect on him growing up. Moving on to the department of the church that Kotomine trained for, we have the Executors. Executors, for all intents and purposes, are the assassins of the church. They're the ones that handle all the dirty work of killing infidels, as well as destroying those previously mentioned unholy abominations, just like in the Kiritsugu flashback. Speaking of which, Kiritsugu revealed an interesting detail in episode 1 of Fate Zero. He said that Kotomine was like him, a mage killer, when referring to him once being an executor, which shows that they're not above murdering people. Executors were specifically tasked with destroying and never exercising or pacifying their targets, which meant these fuckers really meant business. Kotomine trained and did eventually become an executor. That being said, he, by his own volition, dropped out of it and took up other positions. I think this is an interesting bit of information because it establishes two things about him during this period of his life. Firstly, it truly establishes how utterly entrenched Kotomine was in this completely twisted religious environment, given that he was going around taking up different kinds of positions. Secondly, it's also a clear sign of how aimless he was. While he did technically have things to do within the organization, given how he went about it, it was very clear that it was not something he was actually passionate about. This is reinforced during episode 1 of Fate Zero, when Kiritsugu is looking over Kotomine's files and is examining the period of time when he was training under Tokiomi. Kotomine would gain near mastery in a certain discipline only to drop it completely and study the next one without looking back. These are telltale signs of an individual who is just going through the motions and lacks fervor in what they're doing. One would think Kotomine's upbringing alone, given how extreme it was, would be the sole reason for explaining why he is the way he is. But we already know that along with his upbringing, there is something most assuredly wrong with Kotomine at the very core of who he is, the core of his being. This is because what Kotomine felt to be natural to him was considered sinful to those around him, and those around him were almost exclusively comprised of people from the church he worked for. It's pretty clear Kotomine was not what you would call a social butterfly, so I doubt he had many, if any, friends growing up. But you don't have to in order to be affected by those around you. To really get what his character went through, I want to provide some context so you can get a better frame of reference, thus relating to what Kotomine went through on a deeper level. Dear viewer, I ask of you, if you will, to imagine what it would be like growing up and, hypothetically speaking, suddenly gaining an interest in something like, we're gonna say drawing and art for the sake of argument. And also for the sake of argument, let's say you're not really sure on a conscious level what the appeal of drawing art is, but you feel something within you that is inexplicably pulling yourself in that direction. However, for some, admittedly strange and quite frankly fucking unrealistic reason, you're told your entire life by your parents that drawing and art is sinful and wrong. Maybe because they're crazy religious nuts or something. They tell you to throw away those feelings that you have in wanting to pursue it, otherwise you'll burn in hell. And they tell you this for your entire life. By the way, that was all hypothetical, okay? I'm not saying all religious parents are like that. You could put the pitchforks down. Alright, now replace drawing and art with purely negative emotions, and you can start to get an idea of what Kotomine went through growing up. Now this actually ties in with a greater issue, known as the nature versus nurture argument, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here, as there is something else I must point out first. What's very interesting about all of this information regarding how he was brought up to be a priest, was indoctrinated with religious teachings, and was even trained to fucking kill for the church, is that Kotomine admits to have never actually felt the love of God. You would think someone who went through and did all of what Kotomine did would be the most God-fearing motherfucker you ever met. Knowing what I just told you, that might also lead you to believe that Kotomine just might be an atheist in secret. For the sake of transparency, I'm going to go ahead and reveal that when I first started writing this analysis, this was, in fact, one of my initial theories that I had kicked around prior to doing more research and putting more thought into the psychology of his character. So while this may seem like a logical assumption to make when taken at face value, it doesn't actually hold up, and I'm going to explain why. Now, we've already gone over in excruciating detail concerning Kotomine's upbringing, and how religion was inexorably linked with it. Kotomine has been surrounded by religion his entire life, which has had an undoubtable effect on him. This is because when you're a child, your mind is still developing, and is impressionable as a result. To be clear, this doesn't necessarily mean that all of the experiences you go through as a child will play a part in shaping you as you grow up into an adult. You are who you are based on several factors that tie in closely in regards to the nature versus nurture argument, which again I will get into in greater detail a bit later. But this is on the specific topic of what you personally experience in your life. It isn't simply your childhood that has an effect on you, but rather multiple experiences all throughout your life. That being said, if you're conditioned enough, and this is especially true at an early age, then even throughout adulthood, that conditioning can be incredibly difficult to negate. For Kotomine, this conditioning is obviously religion, and by proxy, belief in God. So even if Kotomine admits to never having felt the love of God, like so many others around him, it can be reasonably assumed that his conditioning was such that at this point, the existence of God is an undeniable fact in his mind. So we've confirmed that Kotomine does in fact believe in God. Go fucking figure, the goddamn priest character, of all people, just so happens to believe in God. Never saw that shit coming. Jokes aside, more importantly than just confirming this belief in God, we must ask ourselves, what effect did this have on him? This is not some tertiary confirmation or observation, as this is something that, believe it or not, affected him throughout his entire life, right up until the events of Fate Zero. Now, what exactly do I mean by this? Well, dear viewers, what I mean is that his belief in God is not some arbitrary byproduct of the religion he subscribed to, but rather a driving force behind his attempts at solving his psychological discord. Think about it for a minute. Religious zealots praise the word of God and preach about his love, and more essentially, his salvation. Now we're getting somewhere. You see, when you take into consideration that Kotomine was constantly being exposed to that kind of rhetoric, then the natural conclusion to come to is that he desperately clung to the belief that adhering to the will of God would eventually set him straight. I mean, this is what he was taught. Kotomine knew at an early age that there was something really wrong with him. He may not have fully grasped what exactly it was, but he knew it was there, this thing that existed within him, and he knew he had to fix it in order to bring balance within himself. And the solution he was constantly fed that would aid him is the salvation of God. This also explains why he threw himself so willingly and fervently into the religious environment, even one as obviously perverse as the Holy Church. You know, the one that burns down villages as well as tortures and kills people. Yeah, those saintly fuckers. Well, unfortunately for him, as you might have guessed, given his utterly downtrodden state in Fate Zero, throwing himself so heavily into religion did not yield the results he so desperately yearned for. Instead of finding the salvation and, more importantly, answers he so fiercely searched for during much of his life, he instead found nothing. This meant that all of his efforts merely contributed to further making him a hollow person with no clear goals or direction. He thought God could save him, but at some point in his mind, he came to the conclusion that not even God could bring him the salvation he wanted. Kotomine, as far as he was concerned, was cursed to continue existing as this creature of sinful desires. These were desires that he had no choice but to suppress and deny, which meant he was literally denying who he was. This also brought up a very important question, but also a very simple question for Kotomine. Why? Why would God allow the creation of someone like him? Someone who couldn't be saved? It completely and utterly baffled him, which was yet another contributing factor for his state of mind at the beginning of Fate Zero. Now, I think I teased this long enough. I feel that it would be prudent to finally expand on the topic I briefly mentioned a couple of times now, that being the nature versus nurture argument. The reason is because of how it is key to understanding the core of who Kotomine is. I strongly believe that Kotomine's character is, in fact, the embodiment of the nature versus nurture argument. I'm not talking about the argument as a whole, but rather, more specifically, in favor of the side of nature beating out nurture. For the uninformed, I will lightly touch on the specifics of the topic to give an idea of what it is. The nature versus nurture argument is essentially an ongoing discussion about how much our environment shapes who we become when compared to who we are naturally when you don't take outside stimuli into account. Outside stimuli include elements like the expectations of society, how your parents raised you, and the location that you grew up in. To pose it as a question, the core of the argument is essentially, are we who we are because of how we're raised, or are we naturally predisposed to be who we are because that is within our nature? Now, I don't have the audacity to consider myself an authority on the subject. I'm not a psychologist or social scientist. I'm just an asshole on the internet rambling on about goddamn Chinese cartoons. That being said, I do think I understand it well enough to be confident in my assertion that his character embodies and represents nature beating out nurture. Now, after explaining that, I realized this may confuse some, so I wanted to clarify something. Yes, the conditioning that Kotomine went through, which led him to believing in God, as well as the other conditioning that he went through throughout his life, is more so indicative of nurture rather than nature. That is because even if Kotomine's character thematically embodies and represents the nature side of the argument, that doesn't automatically mean that every facet of his being is reflective of this. The simple reason for this is because all of us, no matter who you are, in some way, you are being affected by some form of conditioning. There's just no way around it. Similar to Guts from Berserk, even if Guts himself, thematically speaking, embodies free will fighting against determinism and fate, we have to accept that one of the most pivotal moments in Berserk, the infamous eclipse, happened because Guts was, in fact, unbeknownst to him, acting as a pawn of fate. The core of Kotomine's being is what's indicative of the nature argument winning out against nurture, and that's what really matters in regards to his character. Whew, alright guys, it's time to take a break. This was a lot to take in, and there's much more to come as we eventually dive headfirst into Kotomine's character arc during the events of Fate Zero itself. To make the information easier to digest, we'll be going over that in part 2. As of uploading this, I'm still working on part 2, so please have some patience. I will get it out when I can. If you're living in the future, however, and the video is done, you can go ahead and click on the annotation of Kotomine's face to jump right into it. Until then, I hope you look forward to part 2. This has been Shintai, chilling in the anime room. Take care, everyone.